I'm 40, but I feel like a child, watching everyone around me get older and die. So I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past? Well, I grouped the last 3 questions together, including this one, because they all allowed me to talk reasonably about these programs. The self-authoring program has a past authoring component that helps people write out an autobiography. Now, you're suffering from what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You're possessed by reminiscences. They won't get out of your mind. And what that means to me is, well, it's one of 2 things. One is that there's things in your past that you need to understand more deeply. And that's why they're still calling to you. And there are things in your past that you had, perhaps, that you need to have in the present and the future. And so you could do the past authoring program and write out your past. It asks you to detail the most emotionally significant events that occurred during different epochs or stages of your life. So you have to break your life into a number of stages. I think we recommended 6, but you can break it into as many as you want or as few. And then to detail out the significant positive and negative occurrences, that stand out in your memory from those times. And that'll kind of help put the past to rest, but it also might highlight for you what it is that you're nostalgic for. And then that can help you figure out what to aim for in the future. And so, it sounds like you're rather hopeless about the present and by implication the future. And maybe that's because you don't have a richly enough developed conception of what it could be. So you could go back to your past and find out what it is that you wanted and had, and then you need to make a plan for how you might obtain that in the future. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that because you talked about death, and so you may be longing in some sense for a return to in a state of blissful ignorance where you weren't concerned about mortality. And, the only real medication for that, I think that's real, is to live as worthwhile a life as you can, as full a life, so you don't have regrets. I'm not sure that so much that people are afraid of death. They're maybe afraid of not living enough. And maybe if you lived enough, you could let it go when it was time. I think there's some truth in that. And so if you're overly afraid of death, it may be because you have a lot of unlived life in the security of a comfortable home life, and I don't have that now. So, well, those are things that now become ambitions, right? Because an ambition and a lack are mirror images of one another. And so if you can identify what you lack, you can derive an ambition from that. And you might say, well, that's impossible. It's like, well, you decompose it into small steps. And that's complicated, but so life is complicated. So there's no way around that. I'm 25. I had a drug problem when I was younger. In my late teens and early 20s, I stole money on multiple occasions. I don't even know who some of those people I stole from are and can't repay them. However, even in the instances where I could apologize or repay, I feel completely unable to. I'm too ashamed. This bothers me all the time. I can't sleep or do anything. I really hate myself. I think that I'm a rotten person and don't know how to handle it. Do you have any advice for this? Well, if I was your therapist, I would say, tell me about every single occasion that you remember where this happened. Now, you can't tell me because I'm not there, but you could write it down. And that would help. And maybe you could write down why you did it. And maybe you could do that with a bit of compassion. Obviously, your behavior was sufficiently reprehensible to be plaguing your conscience, but at least you have a conscience. That's something. And people make mistakes, especially when they're young, especially when they're addled by drug use, let's say. There's plenty of occasion there for misbehavior. That's for sure. And it's pretty common. In any case, you're plagued by this. So the past has still got its tentacles around you. Well, Write it down. Write down every episode. Every time you worry about something like that, write it down and get a list. That's your symptoms. Then, the idea of approaching one of these people and apologizing and offering to repay them, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe you could list all the people that you stole from who you could do that with, and then rank order them in order of difficulty, and then think about how you would approach the least difficult of all those people and what you'd say. And maybe you have to write that out. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it, but you could do that to begin with, and then you could decide whether or not you could do it. And if you could do it with the easiest person, and then you could see how that goes. Maybe that actually helps. And then if you can't do that, maybe there is some other means of clearing your conscience. So when you write all this down, write down how much you took. And then maybe your goal could be you donate twice that amount to a charity. So you have to research charity and find one that you think is really valuable, where it would do some good. And so, you don't have to pay it all back at once, but maybe you could pay once a month or whatever. I don't know what your budget is. Maybe twice a month, maybe once every 3 months, whatever you could afford. And so then you've atoned for your sin, let's say, and you've transformed something bad that the people who experienced have probably already forgotten about. I mean, unless you were stealing huge amounts of money and destroyed their lives, they've probably moved on. And so you could transform your nefarious actions into something that was good. Now, maybe donation to charity, wouldn't do it for you. You could try it once and see if that helps, pay off one of your existential debts and see if that helps. It's a negotiation with yourself. And so then I guess I would also ask, are you more broadly depressed and anxious? You know what I mean? So are you fixating on this in a manner that's truly counterproductive, that's reflective of a deeper issue with depression or anxiety? And you'd know that, for example, if, while you said you can't sleep or do anything, you really hate yourself, that's signs of generalization beyond the confines of these misdeeds. And so if that's the case, then perhaps even if you did atone for what you had done, other preoccupations with previous instances of unacceptable behavior would start to plague you to the same degree. That's a more complex problem, and if that's the case, then, your best bet then is to find a competent mental health professional and have your circumstance evaluated. And, if you're really torturing yourself to death about this, despite the fact that you've apparently ceased your drug abuse, well, maybe there's something else fueling it, and you may need to investigate that. So that's about all I can think of along those lines.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it. You value it. And no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this. I can't stop communicating with my mother, who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, They make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. So
I am way too agreeable. What steps can I take to integrate my shadow and stop being a doormat? All my life I've had so much anger, but I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. I've been through a few different types of therapy and it's a bit better, but still takes me over from time to time. What advice do you have for me? I don't think that there's a better pathway to the shadow, let's say, than resentment. If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is, it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals, and maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity, and so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. Aggression, which can be repressed, sexuality, lust, let's say, which can be repressed. Those things are extremely useful servants when they're integrated into the whole. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. Well, I would say you could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable. Agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth can make an agreeable person, will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. I mean, if you're in a relationship and the person is irritating you with something they've done, you might be highly motivated not to say anything about it because you want to keep the peace. You don't want to upset them. You don't want the conflict. That's all characteristic of high agreeableness. But once you decide to tell the truth, then if you're annoyed, you don't get to hide it. You don't get to assume you're right. You don't get to grab the person by the shirt collar and say, look, I'm annoyed and you're wrong. You get to say, I'm irritated about this situation, and I need to think through that irritation to find out if I have a problem or if you have a problem, or if we both have a problem, or if it's a different problem altogether. But you can't hide the fact that the problem has made itself manifest. And so if you're agreeable and you tell the truth about your emotional state, that will propel you out of that agreeableness by necessity. So, with regards to anger, I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. Well, something a cognitive behavioral therapist might recommend is for a week, and maybe this is already a therapy you've been through, but this exercise is generally quite useful. First, you have to note when you're angry and admit to that, and maybe you have to practice that. So you have to decide, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to see when I'm angry, and I'm going to admit to it, at least to begin with, without judgment. I'm just going to observe it. I'm going to allow myself to observe it. Then you have to allow yourself to see what angry thoughts you have. And you can ask yourself that. What angry thoughts do I frequently have? They'll likely come to mind, maybe many of them. You can jot all those down. Those are ones you're familiar with. And then you can notice when you're angry, and you can ask yourself, well, what am I thinking right at this moment? What angry thoughts am I thinking? And some of them might be quite shocking. You might also manifest themselves in destructive fantasies. You know, maybe you have a fantasy of grabbing somebody by a shirt collar and pushing them up against a wall, or dumping, hot coffee on your boss, or some impulse towards aggression that might manifest itself as a flashing fantasy. And perhaps one that you're shocked by and don't want to admit. You don't want to admit to the existence of it, but you need to see what's happening first in your own imagination if you're going to cope with it. It's also possible that a fair bit of the anger that you have is actually useful if you could just find out what it is and what it's directed toward. So the first tack is to explore the anger. What gives rise to it? What situations give rise to it? What people give rise to it? What are you doing when it happens? And what is the phenomenology of the anger? How does it make itself manifest in image, fantasy, and thought? And then, now you have an anger inventory. Is anger in this situation warranted? What steps do I have to take in order to become less angry? And sometimes that might be an adjustment of an internal psychological adjustment. Sometimes it might require changes in the world. Maybe you're in a relationship that's oppressive, and you have been for a long time, and the way to fix that isn't to adjust your attitude, although it could be, but it might be that it's time to get out of the relationship. And so, differentiation. When are you angry? What elicits it? Why are you angry? Who are you angry at? What are the nature of the angry thoughts? What are the nature of the angry fantasies? All of that. You have to get that out where you can see it. Then you have to walk through it. And you can do that by yourself. You can do that while writing. You can produce counter thoughts. So if you're angry about something, you could outline the reasons why anger is not productive, or you could outline the reasons why it's productive and the reasons it's not productive for a full exploration of the issue. Then I would ask you too, if you're angry all the time, are you depressed? Have you been evaluated clinically? If this is a major problem, is it a manifestation of depression? Because anger is an underdiagnosed symptom of depression. Do you have well thought through goals and plans and strategies? All of that. That's a more comprehensive evaluation of your entire life. And maybe you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. It's highly probable. Most of us have that problem. One of the things the existentialists would say is,
What's the relationship between mental health and responsibility? And that's a good question, because it also has to do with something like the definition of mental health and responsibility. It's like, if you want your life to be well constituted, let's say, whatever that means, and it doesn't mean being happy. See, the reason it can't mean being happy is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to be called on to act when you're not happy. So, for example, when one of your parents dies, you're going to make a choice. You're not going to be happy. That will not be, well, hopefully you won't be. Otherwise, you're tangled in some sort of Freudian nightmare. But let's assume that that's not the case. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be hurt, and maybe even partly broken. So what the hell are you supposed to do then? Well, the answer is, you should be more use than trouble under such circumstances. That's a good thing to strive for, you know, because your mother's going to be, if it's your father, your mother's going to be equally distraught, and so are your siblings, and everyone else you care for. Maybe by that time you should be tough enough so that in that situation, you're good for something. Someone has to make the damn funeral arrangements. Someone has to settle out the will. Someone has to make sure the family doesn't degenerate into horrific squabbling, which is something that often happens after the death of a parent. And you're not going to be motivated to do that by happiness. And what if you have a sick child when you're a parent? Maybe it's a chronic illness. You are not going to be happy about that. You know, it'll be a weight that you carry with you all the time. And it's one of those things that seems particularly unjust. It's like, okay, well, you're no longer happy. Well, if being happy is the purpose of life, well, then you're basically, that's pretty much it for you, isn't it? And, you know, these catastrophes that I'm speaking of, you can be certain that you're going to be exposed to many of those during your life. You know, it'll be a rare period. I think it's a rare period in anyone's life where one or more of such things isn't going on chronically. If it's not you with some terrible health problem or some other terrible problem, then it's a parent or a sibling or a child, or because, you know, you're connected to other people and they're vulnerable too. So that's the lot of human beings. And so if it's happiness, and this is what Solzhenitsyn said about happiness too, he said, happiness is a philosophy who's brought to ruin by the first blow of a guard's truncheon. It's like, yeah, that's about as bluntly as you can put it. Dostoevsky's critique basically said, you can't solve the problem of suffering by formalizing a utopia and joining it like a mass animal. You can't do that because you're not that kind of creature. Even if it was possible, you wouldn't accept it. You'd cause trouble because you're interested in trouble. You're probably more interested in trouble than you are in being happy. Kierkegaard says something similar, but in a more what would you say? In a manner that's more constructive in some sense with regards to what you should do with all that insane energy that you're not going to be able to encapsulate inside a utopia. And it has to do with individual responsibility.
I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. You know, like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but like, it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it. And every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done. And it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio and I would presume a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. Sure. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. You know, 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work.
Yeah.
So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. You know, well, why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, you know? And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And like, I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, you know, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. You know, and a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that.
Positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like, if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. You know, because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on, because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you know, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no? A pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting, because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week, and then you die, because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics, and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place. And, you know, yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems, because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that, in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill, because you make nothing but impulsive decisions. And you know what the real world consequence of that is? You know, you get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. So usually, often, people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative. So it can be ignorance. It can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, you know, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you know, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, it leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things. And that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences are, it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.
What tips would you give a highly emotional person to become more rational and level-headed?
Oh, well, it depends. There's a variety of... The first thing I would do, if you're highly emotional, volatile, fly off the handle, a lot of mood variation, a lot of negative emotion, the first thing you might want to think about is whether or not there's actually something wrong with you, like physically. You might be ill, because illness can do that to people, and so you should go get yourself checked out. You know, you might have an inflammatory condition or something like that. And the next thing I would check out is like, are you sure you're not hungry? I'm dead serious about this. I mean, with many of my clients who've been anxious, like a lot of them, they come in and say, I'm so anxious. I had this one client, she'd come in and she'd say, God, you know, I'm so dead at the end of the day. I'm just wiped out. I've got no energy at all. All I can do is lay down. She was like 24. All I can do is lay down and watch like the same movie I watched the night before. Is that normal? I was like, well, no, it's not. So, and I knew this. I said, well, what do you eat? And she said, well, I usually don't have any breakfast. And then I have like a little bowl of rice for lunch. And I usually have something like that for dinner. And I thought, you live on 2 balls of rice a day, and you're wondering why, when you come home at night after a full day's work, you don't have any energy. I said, well, have you considered the possibility that you're starving to death? So, you know, we talked about this. I said, you can't live like that. That's not going to work. How about let's try this for a week? You do this with therapy, and you do experiments if you're a behavioral therapist. It's like, you got to come to an agreement with the person. It's like, look, is there some other things you'd eat other than rice? You know, like 4 other things. It's like, we agreed. Maybe she'd eat an egg or something. It's like, or I think it was eggs. And I don't remember what it was. There was a few other things. I said, okay, look, here's what you do. Get up in the morning and like have 2 eggs. You don't have to enjoy them. You know, because people say, well, I'm not hungry. It's like, why is that relevant? That's not the issue here. It isn't like gourmet time. It's not starving to death time. So eat your 2 eggs, and maybe in 3 months you'll enjoy it. You know, until then it'll be like chewing down rubbery cardboard, but it's not that big a deal. So, you know, we upped her caloric intake by a factor of about 4, and she came back, and it was like, I think she came back 2 more times. It's like, oh, I have lots of energy now. It's like, oh, good, you're not dying of starvation. If you're a volatile person, try this. Eat a high-protein, high-fat meal in the morning. No sugar. And a big one. Like have a steak. Have something solid. And doesn't matter if you like it. Who cares? Cook it the night before if you don't want to cook it then. Just try it for a week and see what happens. My suspicions, I've had half my clients, I would say, have dropped their volatility levels 50% by eating a high-fat, high-protein breakfast. And then also notice that if you are crabby, you know, and volatile and touchy and you can't get along with anyone, go eat something. Like have 2 teaspoons of peanut butter and wait 10 minutes and see if you're still a witch. So for some people, and if you are a volatile person, like your blood sugar levels tend to move up and down more because you stress yourself out more. For some people, that really matters. And so, look, try it for a week. It's nothing, right? And you might think, oh, God, what you'll find, if it works, is, A, you don't get nearly as upset about the things that used to upset you. So, and that'll be a shock. You'll think, oh my God, I would have flown off the handle because of that before, and now it's hardly bothering me. So that's a lovely thing. And then the second thing is, if something bothers you, you'll recover way faster. And so that's a good start. And so try that. That's no harm. It's not going to hurt you. Try getting up at the same time every day. That's really important. If your sleep-wake cycle is not regular, and you're a volatile person, say biochemically, genetically, having a sleep-wake cycle that's dysregulated is going to be very hard on you. So it doesn't matter quite as much when you go to bed, although it would be good to regularize that too, but at least pick a time. You can pick whatever time you want. Like I would recommend like 8 o'clock or 7:30 because that's what normal people do. And unless you have a really good reason not to be a normal person, you should start by trying to be a normal person if you're being an abnormal person. So try to get up at the same time and try that. You can combine that with eating and see, like my suspicions are 50% improvement virtually immediately with that. And then if that doesn't work, well, then there are more serious things that you can consider. Being checked out by an MD and making sure you're okay. You might want to go talk to a therapist. Having dysregulated negative emotion is no picnic, man, and it's really hard on the people around you as well. So those are that, and I have this program online I mentioned. The other thing you could try is go online. I have this program called Future Authoring. You could do the past authoring program and bring yourself up to date, but Future Authoring is a program that helps you make a plan for your life. And what do you want from your friends, your family, your career, your education? How are you going to take care of yourself mentally and physically? Where would you like to be in 3 to 5 years? How are you going to regulate temptation, drug and alcohol use, and that sort of thing? Keep yourself out of trouble. And how are you going to stop yourself from deteriorating to where you could deteriorate if you weren't careful? You can do a credible job of the program in an hour and a half. It's proved very useful for people. Maybe you're kind of aimless and you need a plan. That's another possibility. But don't live with it. There's lots of things you can try. Sleep. That might be number 1. Food. That's number 2. Number 3, talk to someone. A professional, if it's really out of hand. Because what do you want to do? You want to suffer terribly for the next 10 years? And plus, if you do have a lot of excess negative emotion, it's really hard on you psychophysiologically because you produce a lot of stress hormones, and that makes you old. So it's dangerous physically as well. And it's hard on your brain. So if you can get it fixed, fix it. I don't know what your eating habits are like or your sleeping habits, but if you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 2 things you can do very rapidly, 3 things really, that will help quell that. 4 things even. Number 1, get up at the same time every day. And I would recommend in the morning because that's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast, right? Keep it carbohydrate light. Don't eat toast and and Fruit Loops. That's not going to do the trick. Make it fat and protein heavy and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person and you don't eat in the morning and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. You can't reset it till you go to sleep at night. And I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. I would highly recommend that. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you can do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines. So, you got to figure out what your overanalysis is. It might be cognitive, like maybe you have a very active mind, you're fast verbally. Are you fast verbally? One way you can find that out is to do something like write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S, for example, in 3 minutes. Do that with a bunch of your friends, and if you're someone who writes down way more words than anyone else, then you're verbally fluent, and that might be driving some of your overanalysis. But my guess is that you're suffering from some rumination that's related to anxiety, and so I told you what I think the simplest ways are to rectify that.